The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty fields of Millbrook, Texas, as John Hawkins wiped the sweat from his brow. His calloused hands gripped the worn handle of his hoe, the only tool he could afford to tend his meager plot of land. At 35, John's weathered face and threadbare clothes told a story of hardship and struggle, but his eyes still held a glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished. Little did John know that this sweltering summer day would mark the beginning of a journey that would test his very soul and change the course of his life forever. As he toiled in the unforgiving heat, a gleaming black Cadillac Escalade rolled up the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. The vehicle came to a stop at the edge of John's property, and out stepped Richard Thornton, the wealthiest landowner in Millbrook. His designer suit and perfectly coiffed silver hair stood in stark contrast to John's mud-stained overalls and unkempt appearance. Well, Richard's voice dripped with condescension as he surveyed the modest farmhouse and the struggling crops. If it isn't John Hawkins, still playing farmer on this worthless piece of dirt. John straightened his back, trying to muster what little dignity he had left. Mr. Thornton, he nodded, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. What brings you out to my humble farm? Richard's lips curled into a cruel smile. Oh, I just thought I'd come by and see if you've finally come to your senses. You know my offer still stands. I'll take this land off your hands for a generous sum. God knows it's more than this pitiful excuse for a farm is worth. John's grip tightened on his hoe. This land had been in his family for generations, and despite its current state, it was all he had left of his parents' legacy. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thornton, but as I've said before, this farm isn't for sale. Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're a fool, Hawkins. A stubborn, simpleton fool. Look around you. Your crops are failing, your house is falling apart, and you can barely feed yourself, let alone turn a profit. Face it, you're not cut out for this life. Each word was like a dagger to John's heart, but he stood his ground. This land means more to me than money, Mr. Thornton. It's my home, my heritage. I won't give up on it. Heritage? Richard scoffed, his voice rising. What heritage? The heritage of failure? Of poverty? You're clinging to a dying dream, Hawkins. You're an embarrassment to this town, a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't know when to quit. As if on cue, a group of farmhands from Richard's vast estate pulled up in a pickup truck. They gathered around, snickering and pointing at John's rundown property. Boys, Richard called out, a wicked gleam in his eye, take a good look. This is what becomes of a man who doesn't know his place in the world. John here thinks he can be a farmer, but all he's managed to grow is debt and despair. The farmhands erupted in cruel laughter, their jeers echoing across the barren field. John felt his face burn with shame, but he refused to lower his gaze. You may mock me, Mr. Thornton, John said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion, but at least I have my integrity. This land may not be much, but it's mine, and I'll work it with pride until the day I die. Richard's amusement turned to anger. Pride? What good is pride when you can't put food on the table? When you can't pay your bills? Face it, Hawkins, you're a failure, and everyone in Millbrook knows it. As if to punctuate Richard's words, a gust of wind swept across the field, stirring up a cloud of dust from the parched earth. John's shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth in Richard's cruel words. He was struggling, barely keeping his head above water. But he wouldn't give up. Now listen here, you pathetic excuse for a man, Richard continued, stepping closer until he was mere inches from John's face. I'm going to make you an offer one last time. Sell me this worthless plot, and I'll give you enough money to start a new life somewhere else. Somewhere where you won't be a constant reminder of failure to everyone around you. John's heart raced, his mind reeling from the onslaught of humiliation. For a brief moment, he was tempted. The money could solve so many of his problems, give him a fresh start. But then he thought of his parents, of the generations of Hawkins who had worked this land before him. He couldn't betray their memory. "No," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, Mr. Thornton. I won't sell. Not now, not ever." Richard's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, Hawkins. Mark my words, I'll see you run out of Millbrook if it's the last thing I do. You're nothing but a stain on this community, and I won't rest until you're gone." With that, Richard stormed back to his Escalade, his farmhands trailing behind him like obedient dogs. As the vehicles pulled away, kicking up a cloud of dust, John was left alone in the oppressive heat, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He looked out over his struggling crops, at the peeling paint of his farmhouse, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to weep. Tears of frustration, of anger, of despair rolled down his cheeks, mingling with the sweat and grime on his face. But even as he cried, a small spark of defiance flickered in his heart. He may be down, but he wasn't out. Not yet. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parched earth, John made his way back to the farmhouse. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of Richard Thornton's words still pressing down on him. He pushed open the creaking screen door and stepped into the dimly lit kitchen. The room was small and sparse, with outdated appliances and worn linoleum floors, but it was clean and tidy, a testament to John's determination to maintain some semblance of dignity despite his circumstances. As he moved to the sink to wash the day's grime from his hands, a soft voice called out from the living room. "John? Is that you?" "Yeah, Ma, it's me," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah Hawkins, John's mother, wheeled herself into the kitchen. At 65, she was a frail shadow of the vibrant woman she had once been. A stroke 2 years ago had left her partially paralyzed and unable to help with the farm work, adding to John's burdens. "Oh, honey," Sarah said, her eyes filling with concern as she took in her son's defeated posture. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" John couldn't bring himself to meet his mother's gaze. How could he tell her about the humiliation he had endured? How could he admit that maybe, just maybe, Richard Thornton was right? "It's nothing, Ma," he lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a long day in the fields, that's all." Sarah wheeled closer, reaching out to take her son's calloused hand in her own. "John Hawkins, don't you dare try to fool your mother. I may be in this chair, but there's nothing wrong with my eyes or my heart. Now tell me what's troubling you." The gentleness in her voice broke something inside John. Before he knew it, words were spilling out of him like water from a burst dam. He told her about Richard Thornton's visit, about the cruel taunts and the tempting offer. He spoke of his fear that he was failing not just himself, but the entire Hawkins legacy. As he talked, Sarah listened quietly, her eyes never leaving her son's face. When John finally fell silent, emotionally spent, she squeezed his hand. "Oh, my brave, stubborn boy," she said softly. "You've carried so much on your shoulders for so long. But listen to me, you are not a failure. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become." "But Ma," John protested, his voice cracking, "look around us. The farm is barely producing enough to keep us afloat. I can't afford to hire help or buy new equipment. Maybe Richard Thornton is right. Maybe I should just sell and—" "Stop right there," Sarah interrupted, her voice suddenly stern. "John Michael Hawkins, you listen to me. This land isn't just soil and crops. It's our history, our home. Your great-grandfather cleared this land with nothing but an axe and sheer determination. Your grandfather survived the Dust Bowl by sheer force of will. And your father, oh, your father loved every inch of this place." She paused, her eyes misting over with memories. "Do you remember what he used to say? A Hawkins never quits. We bend, but we don't break." John nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I remember, Ma. But sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to live up to that legacy." Sarah's gaze softened. "Strength isn't about never falling, John. It's about getting back up every time you do. And you, my son, have gotten up more times than I can count. That's the true Hawkins legacy, not the land itself, but the spirit that refuses to be beaten." As Sarah spoke, something stirred in John's chest, a warmth that began to push back against the cold despair that had taken root. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw not just the frail woman in the wheelchair, but the strength that radiated from her very being. "You're right, Ma," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I can't give up. I won't give up. Richard Thornton and his money be damned, this is our home, and I'll fight for it with everything I've got." Sarah smiled, a glimmer of pride shining in her eyes. "That's my boy. Now, why don't you get cleaned up? I managed to put together a pot of stew earlier. It's not much, but it'll fill your belly." As John headed to the bathroom to wash up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day's humiliation still stung, but it no longer threatened to overwhelm him. He had forgotten, just for a moment, what it meant to be a Hawkins. But his mother's words had rekindled the fire in his soul. Little did John know that fate was about to deal him a hand that would test his newfound resolve to its very limits, and set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of Millbrook itself. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning dawned clear and bright, but John's mood remained as overcast as a winter sky. Despite his renewed determination, the reality of his situation weighed heavily upon him. As he made his way to the barn to begin his daily chores, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a losing battle. The old red barn, once the pride of the Hawkins farm, now stood as a testament to John's struggles. Its paint was faded and peeling, the roof sagged ominously in places, and the doors creaked in protest as John pushed them open. Inside, the scent of hay and livestock filled the air. John's small herd of dairy cows, now down to just 5 after he'd been forced to sell off most of the herd to make ends meet, greeted him with soft moos. As he began the morning milking, his mind wandered to the stack of unpaid bills sitting on the kitchen table. "What am I going to do?" he muttered to himself, his hands working automatically as his thoughts spiraled. "The bank's threatening to foreclose, the crops are failing, and now Thornton's breathing down my neck." So lost was he in his worries that he almost missed the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. Frowning, John set down his milk pail and made his way to the barn door. Who could be visiting at this hour? As he stepped out into the morning sunlight, he saw a battered pickup truck parked in front of the house. A young woman was climbing out, her long dark hair catching the light as she turned to survey the farm. John's heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned. "Emily," he called out, hardly daring to believe his eyes. "Emily Rodriguez, is that you?" The woman turned, a brilliant smile lighting up her face. "John Hawkins. I was hoping I'd find you here." Emily Rodriguez had been John's closest friend growing up. The daughter of migrant workers who had settled in Millbrook, she had spent countless summers helping out on the Hawkins farm. But it had been years since John had seen her, not since she'd left for college in California, chasing dreams bigger than their small Texas town could contain. As Emily walked towards him, John was struck by how little she had changed. Her eyes still held that spark of mischief, her smile still as warm and genuine as ever. But there was something else there too, a confidence, a worldliness that spoke of the years she'd spent away. "What in the world are you doing here?" John asked, unable to keep the smile from his face despite his troubles. Seeing Emily was like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Emily's smile faltered slightly. Well, that's a bit of a long story. Mind if we talk inside? I could use a cup of coffee, assuming you still make it strong enough to strip paint? John chuckled, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. For you? I'll make it strong enough to raise the dead. Come on in. As they made their way to the house, John couldn't help but notice Emily taking in the state of the farm. He saw the concern flash across her face, quickly hidden behind a smile when she caught him looking. It made his chest tighten with shame, but he pushed the feeling aside. Emily had always been able to see right through him. There was no use trying to hide the truth of his situation. Inside the kitchen, John busied himself with making coffee while Emily settled at the worn kitchen table. Sarah, hearing voices, wheeled herself in from the living room. Emily Rodriguez, she exclaimed, her face lighting up. As I live and breathe. Come here and give this old woman a hug. Emily rushed to embrace Sarah, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the wheelchair. John saw the questions forming, but Emily, ever tactful, didn't ask. Instead, she launched into a cheerful account of her journey from California, skillfully drawing Sarah into the conversation. As John set mugs of steaming coffee on the table, he marveled at how easily Emily slipped back into their lives, as if she'd never left. For a moment, he could almost forget the weight of his troubles. But reality had a way of asserting itself. As the initial excitement of the reunion settled, Emily's expression grew serious. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeming to gather her thoughts. John, Mrs. Hawkins, she began, her voice taking on a note of hesitation that immediately put John on alert. I have to be honest with you. My being here, it's not just a social call. John felt his guard go up. What do you mean? Emily took a deep breath. I'm here on behalf of the California-based company I work for, Green Future Enterprises. We're looking to invest in sustainable agriculture projects, and, well, Millbrook is on our radar. John's coffee suddenly tasted bitter in his mouth. Invest? You mean buy up land? Not exactly, Emily hurried to explain. We're more interested in partnerships. Working with existing farmers to transition to more sustainable, profitable methods. John, I've seen the amazing work we've done in other communities. I hoped. She trailed off, clearly seeing the storm gathering on John's face. Sarah reached out, placing a calming hand on her son's arm. I think what Emily is trying to say, Sarah said gently, is that she came here to help. Isn't that right, dear? Emily nodded earnestly. Exactly. John, I know things have been tough. I've heard the rumors, seen the state of the farm. But I also know you. I know how much this land means to you, how hard you're willing to work. I thought maybe, with our company's resources and your dedication, we could turn things around. John felt a whirlwind of emotions sweeping through him. On one hand, the idea of help, real, tangible help, was tempting beyond belief. On the other, pride and suspicion warred within him. He'd been burned before by smooth-talking businessmen promising the moon. I appreciate the thought, Emily, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. But I've had my fill of outsiders trying to tell me how to run my farm. How do I know this isn't just another scheme to get my land? Emily's eyes flashed with hurt, but she quickly composed herself. John, I understand your skepticism. But please, hear me out. Green Future isn't interested in taking your land. We want to work with you, to help you make it profitable again. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek tablet. With a few taps, she pulled up a series of charts and graphs. Look, these are results from similar partnerships we've established in drought-stricken areas of California. Crop yields increased by 40% in the first year alone, with a 30% reduction in water usage. Despite himself, John found his interest piqued. He leaned in, studying the figures with a farmer's keen eye. And how exactly did they manage that? Emily's face lit up, sensing his interest. A combination of factors. Drought-resistant crop varieties, precision irrigation systems, soil health management. It's all about working smarter, not just harder. As Emily launched into a detailed explanation of Green Future's methods, John felt a dangerous spark of hope igniting in his chest. It all sounded so promising, so achievable. But years of struggle had taught him to be wary of things that seemed too good to be true. "It sounds impressive," he admitted. "But I can't help wondering what's in it for your company. You're not a charity, after all." Emily nodded, appreciating his directness. "You're right, we're not. Green Future takes a percentage of the increased profits for a set number of years. But John, even with that, our partner farmers are making more than they ever did before. And after the contract period, all the improvements, all the equipment, it's yours to keep." Sarah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "It sounds like a wonderful opportunity, John. At least worth considering, don't you think?" John ran a hand through his hair, feeling torn. "I don't know, Ma. It's a big decision. I can't just jump into something like this without thinking it through." Emily reached across the table, placing her hand on John's arm. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, reminding him of feelings he'd thought long buried. "I understand, John. I'm not asking you to decide right now. Take some time, think it over. I'll be in town for a week. We can talk more, I can show you more data, answer any questions you have." John nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "All right, that seems fair. I appreciate you bringing this to me, Emily. Really, I do. It's just a lot to take in," Emily finished for him, her smile understanding. "I get it. How about this, why don't I come by tomorrow? I can take a look around the farm, maybe offer some initial thoughts. No pressure, just a fresh perspective." The idea made John uncomfortable. Having Emily see the full extent of the farm's decline felt like exposing a raw nerve. But he could see the genuine desire to help in her eyes, and found himself nodding. "Okay. Tomorrow it is." As Emily gathered her things to leave, promising to return the next day, John walked her to her truck. In the bright Texas sunlight, he was struck again by how beautiful she had become. It wasn't just her physical appearance, there was a confidence, a passion about her that was undeniably attractive. "It really is good to see you, Emily," he said softly as she climbed into the driver's seat. "Whatever comes of this business proposal, I'm glad you're here." Emily's smile was warm, tinged with something John couldn't quite identify. "Me too, John. More than you know." With a final wave, she drove off, leaving John standing in a cloud of dust, his mind swirling with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. As he turned back towards the house, John caught sight of a familiar black Escalade cruising slowly past the farm. Richard Thornton's face was clearly visible behind the wheel, his expression a mixture of curiosity and displeasure. The sight sent a chill down John's spine. Whatever was happening, he had a feeling things in Millbrook were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning dawned bright and early, finding John already hard at work in the fields. He barely slept, his mind too full of Emily's proposal and the potential it held. Part of him wanted to embrace it wholeheartedly, it could be the lifeline he so desperately needed. But another part, the part shaped by years of struggle and disappointment, urged caution. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John heard the now familiar sound of Emily's truck approaching. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow, and tried to quell the nervous flutter in his stomach. Emily hopped out of the truck, looking fresh and energetic despite the growing heat. She was dressed practically in jeans and a light blue shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Morning, John," she called out cheerfully. "Ready for that tour?" John couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, gesturing around at the struggling crops. "Though I warn you, it's not a pretty sight." Emily's eyes softened with understanding. "John, I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help, remember? Now come on, show me what we're working with." For the next couple of hours, John led Emily around the farm, explaining his current methods, pointing out problem areas, and sharing his frustrations. To his surprise, he found himself opening up more than he had in years. There was something about Emily's presence, her attentive listening, her insightful questions, that made him feel truly heard. As they walked, Emily occasionally tapped notes into her tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You know," she said as they paused by a particularly parched section of field, "I think I'm starting to see the big picture here. John, you've been fighting an uphill battle, but you've done remarkably well considering the circumstances." John scoffed, gesturing at the withered crops. "You call this doing well?" Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch sending that same jolt through him. "I call keeping this farm afloat in the face of drought, outdated equipment, and what I suspect has been some serious opposition doing well, yes." Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of admiration and something else, something that made John's heart race. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, John Hawkins." For a moment, they stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then Emily cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Right, let's head back to the house. I think I've got some ideas I'd like to run by you." As they approached the farmhouse, John was surprised to see his mother sitting on the porch, engaged in conversation with a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and distinguished-looking, with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking suit that seemed out of place in the dusty farm setting. "Ma?" John called out as they drew closer. "Everything okay?" Sarah turned, a smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, John. Emily. Come meet Mr. Jameson. He's here on behalf of Thornton Enterprises." John felt his body tense, his guard immediately going up. Emily must have sensed his discomfort because she stepped closer, her arm brushing against his in a gesture of silent support. Mr. Jameson stood, extending his hand with a polished smile. "Ah, Mr. Hawkins. A pleasure to finally meet you. I was just explaining to your charming mother that Mr. Thornton has authorized me to increase our offer for your property by 15%. A very generous proposition, I'm sure you'll agree." John felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He ignored the outstretched hand, his voice cold when he spoke. "Mr. Jameson, I've already told Mr. Thornton multiple times that this farm is not for sale. At any price." Jameson's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Come now, Mr. Hawkins. Surely you can see that this is a losing battle. Mr. Thornton is offering you a way out, a chance to walk away with your dignity intact." "My dignity?" John's voice rose, his fists clenching at his sides. "My dignity is tied to this land, Mr. Jameson. It's not for sale, and neither am I." Jameson's facade of friendliness fell away, revealing the steel beneath. "I'd advise you to reconsider your position, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Thornton is not a man accustomed to being denied what he wants. Things could become difficult for you if you persist in this foolishness." Emily stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Are you threatening him? Because that sounds an awful lot like a threat to me." Jameson turned his cold gaze on Emily, taking in her professional attire and tablet. "And you are?" "Emily Rodriguez, Green Future Enterprises," she replied, her voice sharp. "We're in discussions with Mr. Hawkins about a partnership to revitalize this farm. So I suggest you take your threats elsewhere." A flicker of surprise crossed Jameson's face before he could mask it. He looked between John and Emily, clearly reassessing the situation. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, this is an interesting development. Mr. Thornton will be very interested to hear about this." He turned back to John, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over, Hawkins. One way or another, Thornton Enterprises will have this land. You'd do well to remember that." With that, he strode off to a sleek car parked on the road, leaving a tense silence in his wake. As the sound of Jameson's car faded into the distance, John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Emily, a mixture of gratitude and confusion on his face. "Emily, thank you. But why did you say we were in discussions? We haven't agreed to anything yet." Emily met his gaze steadily. "Because I saw the look in that man's eyes, John. He was here to intimidate you, to bully you into selling. I couldn't just stand by and let that happen." Sarah wheeled herself closer, concern etched on her face. "John, honey, maybe we should consider Mr. Thornton's offer. If things are going to get difficult." "No, Ma," John said firmly. "We're not selling. Not to Thornton, not to anyone." He turned to Emily, a new determination in his eyes. "You said you had some ideas? Well, I'm all ears. Whatever it takes, I'm going to save this farm. And if that means partnering with Green Future, then that's what we'll do." Emily's face lit up with a brilliant smile. "Really? Oh, John, you won't regret this. Come on, let's go inside. I have so much to show you." As they headed into the house, John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of real hope. With Emily by his side and the resources of Green Future behind him, maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. But as he closed the door behind them, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Richard Thornton wasn't a man to give up easily, and John had a sinking feeling that their battle was far from over. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Over the next few days, John and Emily threw themselves into planning. The kitchen table became their command center, covered in papers, charts, and Emily's ever-present tablet. Sarah watched with growing excitement as the two worked together, their heads bent close, voices animated as they discussed crop rotations, irrigation systems, and soil management techniques. "It's like watching you two as kids again," Sarah commented one evening as Emily was preparing to leave. "Always thick as thieves, plotting your next adventure." John felt a warmth spread through his chest at his mother's words. Working with Emily had awakened something in him, a passion and drive he'd thought long lost. And if he was being honest with himself, it had awakened other feelings too, ones he was both thrilled and terrified to examine too closely. As the week progressed, their plans began to take shape. Green Future would provide the capital for new equipment and irrigation systems, as well as access to drought-resistant seed varieties. In return, they would take a percentage of the profits for 5 years, after which the farm would be fully John's again, hopefully thriving and modernized. "It's a solid plan, John," Emily said on the 5th day, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smile. "With these implementations, I truly believe we can turn this farm around within a year." John nodded, allowing himself to feel a spark of optimism. "I think you're right. I can't thank you enough for this, Emily. You've given us, hope." Emily reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to thank me, John. This farm, this community, it means as much to me as it does to you. I couldn't stand by and watch it wither away." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken emotions. John found himself leaning in, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching. The sharp trill of a cell phone shattered the moment. Emily jumped, quickly pulling her hand away as she fumbled for her phone. I should take this," she mumbled, her cheeks flushed as she hurried outside. John sat back, his heart pounding. What had just almost happened? And why did he feel so disappointed that it hadn't? He was still lost in thought when Emily returned, her face pale and troubled. "John," she said, her voice tight with worry, "we have a problem. A big one." John felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" Emily sank into her chair, running a hand through her hair. "That was my boss. Apparently, Richard Thornton has been making some calls. He's trying to buy out Green Future." "What?" John exclaimed, shock coursing through him. "Can he do that?" Emily shook her head, frustration evident in her voice. "I don't know. Green Future is a public company, so theoretically, anyone with enough money could make a play for it. But Thornton, he's moving fast. He's already acquired a significant number of shares." John slumped in his chair, the weight of this new threat pressing down on him. If he succeeds, if he buys Green Future, then our partnership is dead in the water, Emily finished grimly. Worse, he'd have access to all our plans, all our projections. He'd know exactly how to undercut us. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. John felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Just when he dared to hope, to dream of a better future, it was all threatening to slip away. But as he looked at Emily, saw the determination in her eyes despite her worry, something stirred within him. A fire that had long been banked roared to life. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "No, we're not going to let this happen. We've come too far, worked too hard. There has to be a way to stop him." Emily looked at him, a spark of hope igniting in her eyes. "You're right. We can't give up. But John, we're going to need help. This is bigger than just us now." John nodded, his mind racing. "The town," he said suddenly. "Thornton's been buying up land all over Millbrook, hasn't he? I bet we're not the only ones he's strong-armed. If we could rally the town, show them what's at stake." A united front, Emily breathed, excitement building in her voice. "John, that's brilliant. If we can get enough local support, create enough negative publicity around Thornton's takeover attempt, we might be able to scare off potential shareholders," John finished, feeling a surge of energy. "It's a long shot, but..." "It's a shot," Emily said firmly. "And right now, it's the best one we've got." John nodded, a newfound determination setting his jaw. "Then let's do it. We'll start first thing in the morning. We'll go door to door if we have to, but we're going to make sure everyone in Millbrook knows what's really going on." Emily's eyes shone with admiration and something deeper, something that made John's heart skip a beat. "I knew you had it in you, John Hawkins. You're not just a farmer, you're a fighter." As they bent their heads together, planning their next moves, neither of them noticed Sarah watching from the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. The battle for Millbrook was about to begin, and Sarah had a feeling that more than just the fate of the farm hung in the balance. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning dawned bright and early, finding John and Emily already hard at work. They had spent half the night preparing flyers, crafting a message that they hoped would resonate with the people of Millbrook. Now, as the sun peeked over the horizon, they set out to spread the word. Their first stop was the Millbrook Diner, a local institution that had been serving up hearty breakfasts and gossip in equal measure for generations. As they pushed through the door, the cheerful tinkle of the bell announced their arrival, causing several heads to turn. "Well, I'll be," drawled Joe Baker, the diner's owner, from behind the counter. "If it isn't John Hawkins and Emily Rodriguez? Land's sakes, girl, when did you get back to town?" Emily smiled warmly. "Hello, Mr. Baker. It's good to see you. I'm actually here on business, and John and I have some important information we'd like to share with everyone." A hush fell over the diner as John cleared his throat. "Folks, I know many of you have been approached by Richard Thornton or his representatives about selling your land. I'm here to tell you that there's more going on than meets the eye." Over the next hour, John and Emily laid out the situation: Thornton's aggressive land grabs, his attempt to buy out Green Future, and the potential consequences for Millbrook if he succeeded. To their relief, they found an attentive and increasingly concerned audience. "I always knew that Thornton was up to no good," muttered old Tom Wilson, a retired rancher. "But this is something else. He's not just after our land, he's after our way of life." Nods of agreement rippled through the diner. John felt a surge of hope. "That's why we need your help," he said earnestly. "We're planning a town meeting tonight at the community center. We need to show Thornton and his investors that Millbrook won't be bullied or bought." As they left the diner, armed with promises from nearly everyone to attend the meeting and spread the word, Emily turned to John with a grin. "That went even better than I hoped. I think we really struck a chord." John nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Let's just hope it's enough. Thornton's not going to take this lying down." His words proved prophetic. As they made their way down Main Street, handing out flyers and talking to shopkeepers, they spotted a familiar black Escalade pulling up to the curb. Richard Thornton himself stepped out, his face darkening as he caught sight of John and Emily. Well, Thornton sneered as he approached them. "If it isn't the dynamic duo. I hear you've been busy this morning, spreading lies and stirring up trouble." John stood his ground, meeting Thornton's gaze steadily. "We're not spreading lies, Thornton. We're telling people the truth, something you should try sometime." Thornton's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Watch yourself, Hawkins. You're playing a dangerous game. I've crushed bigger operations than your pathetic little farm. What makes you think you stand a chance?" It was Emily who answered, her voice cool and composed. "Because he's not alone, Mr. Thornton. The people of Millbrook are starting to see through your act. And once your investors realize the kind of opposition they're facing, they might just decide you're not worth the trouble." For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Thornton's face. But it was quickly replaced by a mask of contempt. "We'll see about that. Enjoy your little rebellion while it lasts. By this time next week, I'll own half this town, including your precious farm." As Thornton stormed off, John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Emily placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Don't let him get to you, John. He's scared, that's why he's lashing out." John nodded, drawing strength from her touch. "You're right. Come on, we've got a lot more people to talk to before tonight." The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. John and Emily crisscrossed Millbrook, talking to anyone who would listen. To their surprise and relief, they found a receptive audience almost everywhere they went. It seemed that Thornton's heavy-handed tactics had not endeared him to the townspeople, and many were eager for a chance to push back. As evening approached, they made their way to the community center. John's stomach was in knots as he saw the crowds of people filing in. This was it, the moment of truth. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The hall was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the lobby. As John made his way to the front, he saw familiar faces everywhere, neighbors, friends, even people he had disagreements with in the past. All of them were here, united against a common threat. Taking a deep breath, John stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. For a moment, he faltered, overwhelmed by the responsibility resting on his shoulders. Then he felt Emily's presence beside him, solid and reassuring, and found his voice. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Thank you for coming out tonight. We're here because our community is facing a threat to our lands, our livelihoods, and our way of life." Over the next hour, John and Emily laid out their case. They explained Thornton's tactics, his attempt to buy out Green Future, and the devastating impact his plans would have on Millbrook. They shared their vision for a revitalized community, one where sustainable farming practices could bring prosperity to all. As they spoke, John could see the mood in the room shifting. Confusion gave way to understanding, apathy to anger, and finally, to determination. When they finished, the silence was deafening. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, "What can we do to help?" It was as if a dam had broken. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, offering suggestions, volunteering their time and resources. John felt a lump form in his throat as he realized that these people, his people, were ready to stand with him. As the meeting broke up into smaller groups, each tasked with a specific role in their plan, Emily pulled John aside. Her eyes were shining with excitement and something else, something that made John's heart race. "We did it, John," she said softly. "We really did it." Before John could respond, a commotion at the entrance caught their attention. Richard Thornton burst into the hall, his face red with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed. "You think you can turn my own investments against me?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation. John stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about you, Thornton. It's about all of us, about preserving our community and our way of life." Thornton sneered. "Your way of life? Wake up, Hawkins. This town is dying. I'm offering you all a chance to get out while you still can." "No," came a voice from the crowd. It was old Tom Wilson, the retired rancher. "You're offering to line your own pockets at our expense." "Well, we're not buying it anymore." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Thornton looked around, seeming to realize for the first time that he was outnumbered and unwelcome. His face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this," he spat. "All of you. I'll bury this town so deep it'll never see the light of day again." As Thornton stormed out, slamming the door behind him, a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople. John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. True to their word, the people of Millbrook rallied around John and Emily's cause. A social media campaign was launched, highlighting Thornton's unethical practices and the potential devastation his plans would wreak on the community. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it was making headlines across the state. The effect on Thornton's attempted takeover of Green Future was dramatic. Investors, wary of the negative publicity in the united front presented by Millbrook, began to pull out. Green Future's stock price stabilized, and Thornton's bid faltered. But even as things were looking up on that front, John and Emily faced challenges on the farm. True to his word, Thornton seemed determined to make their lives difficult. Mysterious equipment breakdowns, delayed deliveries, and even attempts to divert their water supply kept them constantly on their toes. Through it all, John and Emily worked side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The connection between them, once a warm ember of childhood friendship, had blazed into something much more profound. Yet neither of them seemed willing to take that final step, both too focused on the challenges at hand to explore their deepening feelings. It was Sarah who finally broke the tension. One evening, as John and Emily pored over crop projections at the kitchen table, she wheeled herself into the room with a determined look on her face. "All right, you two," she said firmly. "Enough is enough. I've watched you dance around each other for weeks now. It's time you both admitted what's really going on here." John and Emily exchanged startled glances, both blushing furiously. "Ma," John began, but Sarah cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Don't you ma me, John Hawkins. I've seen the way you look at each other when you think no one's watching. Life's too short for this nonsense. Emily, dear, do you have feelings for my son?" Emily's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing an even deeper shade of red. But as she looked at John, a softness came into her expression. Yes, she admitted quietly. "I do." Sarah nodded, satisfied, then turned her piercing gaze on her son. "And you, John? What about you?" John felt as if his heart might burst out of his chest. He looked at Emily, saw the hope and vulnerability in her eyes, and suddenly all his fears and doubts melted away. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yes, I do." Sarah smiled triumphantly. "Well, thank the Lord for that. Now kiss her, you fool, before I have to do it for you." With a laugh that was half joy, half disbelief, John reached for Emily. As their lips met, it felt like coming home, like every struggle, every hardship had been leading to this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Sarah was nowhere to be seen. Somehow, she had managed to slip out of the room unnoticed, giving them their privacy. "Well," Emily said, her eyes sparkling, "I guess the cat's out of the bag." John chuckled, pulling her close. "I guess so. I'm just sorry it took us so long to get here." Emily shook her head, her expression turning serious. "Don't be. Everything happens in its own time, John. And right now, this feels pretty perfect to me." As they leaned in for another kiss, John silently agreed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that with Emily by his side, he could face anything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The new farming techniques implemented with Green Futures help started to show results. The once parched fields of the Hawkins farm began to green, promising a bountiful harvest. But it wasn't just John's farm that was thriving. All across Millbrook, farmers who had partnered with Green Future were seeing similar results. The town, which had been teetering on the brink of becoming just another dried-up rural community, was coming back to life. Richard Thornton, however, was not one to admit defeat easily. As his plans for a hostile takeover of Green Future crumbled, he turned his attention to more direct methods of retaliation. One crisp autumn morning, John awoke to the sound of heavy machinery. Racing outside, he was met with a horrifying sight. A team of workers, backed by several of Thornton's security guards, were setting up drilling equipment at the edge of his property. "What the hell is going on here?" John demanded, striding up to the foreman. The man looked uncomfortable but stood his ground. "We're here on Mr. Thornton's orders. Apparently, there's an untapped oil reserve under this land. He's exercising his mineral rights." John felt the blood drain from his face. If there was oil under his farm, Thornton could destroy everything they'd worked for without ever setting foot on the property. "You can't do this," he said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "This is my land." One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered weapon. I suggest you step back, Mr. Hawkins. We have all the necessary permits. Don't make this difficult. For a moment, John was tempted to charge forward, consequences be damned. But then he thought of Emily, of his mother, of all the people in town counting on him. He couldn't throw it all away in a moment of anger. Swallowing his rage, John turned and strode back to the house. He had calls to make. The next few days were a blur of legal consultations, emergency town meetings, and frantic calls to Emily's contacts at Green Future. John barely slept, the constant drone of the drilling equipment a maddening reminder of how close they were to losing everything. It was Emily who finally found their ray of hope. "John," she called out, bursting into the kitchen where he sat slumped over a stack of legal documents. "I think I've found something." John looked up, hope warring with exhaustion in his eyes. "What is it?" Emily spread out a series of old maps on the table. "I've been digging through the county records. Look at this land survey from 1932. See this notation here?" John leaned in, squinting at the faded markings. "It looks like, wait, is that an old water rights designation?" Emily nodded excitedly. "Exactly. And look at the date on Thornton's mineral rights claim. It's from 1945. John, don't you see? The water rights predate the mineral rights." John's eyes widened as the implications sank in. Which means, Emily finished triumphantly, that if we can prove that drilling would interfere with the aquifer, we might be able to stop Thornton in his tracks. It was a slim chance, but it was more than they'd had before. Armed with this new information, John and Emily threw themselves into building their case. They brought in geologists, environmental experts, and water rights attorneys. The entire town rallied around them, contributing funds for legal fees and providing whatever support they could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of legal wrangling, the day of the hearing arrived. The Millbrook courthouse was packed, with people spilling out into the hallways. John sat at the plaintiff's table, Emily's hand clasped tightly in his, as their attorney made their case. Richard Thornton sat on the other side of the aisle, his face a mask of smug confidence. But as the evidence mounted, expert testimony about the fragility of the aquifer, historical documents proving the precedence of water rights, and passionate pleas from community members about the importance of sustainable agriculture, John saw that confidence began to waver. When the judge finally rendered her decision, the courtroom erupted in cheers. The drilling would have to stop immediately, and Thornton's mineral rights claim was deemed subordinate to the existing water rights. As Thornton stormed out of the courtroom, his face purple with rage, John felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Mr. Jameson, Thornton's right-hand man, standing there with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Hawkins," Jameson said quietly, "I wonder if we might have a word in private." Puzzled but cautious, John nodded. He squeezed Emily's hand reassuringly before following Jameson to a quiet corner of the courthouse. Jameson looked around to ensure they weren't overheard, then spoke in a low voice. "Mr. Hawkins, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation. Understood?" John nodded, his curiosity piqued. Jameson took a deep breath. "Thornton Enterprises is finished. The board of directors has called for Richard's resignation in light of this debacle and the negative publicity it's generated. The company's stock is in freefall." John's eyes widened in surprise. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Jameson continued, "I've been authorized to make you an offer. The board wants to salvage what's left of the company's reputation. They're prepared to sell off all of Thornton's land holdings in Millbrook at a significant discount to a coalition of local farmers. Consider it reparations for the damage done." John was stunned. This was more than he could have ever hoped for. I'll need to discuss this with the town, with Emily and Green Future. But Mr. Jameson, why the change of heart? Jameson's expression softened slightly. Let's just say that some of us have been looking for a way out from under Richard's thumb for a long time. You and Ms. Rodriguez, you showed us there was another way. A better way. He extended his hand. Good luck, Mr. Hawkins. I think Millbrook is in good hands. As Jameson walked away, John felt as if he were in a dream. He made his way back to Emily, who was waiting with a concerned expression. John? What was that about? What did Jameson want? John looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. Emily, you're not going to believe this, but I think we just won. Not just the court case, everything. Over the next few weeks, John worked tirelessly with Emily, Green Future, and the other farmers of Millbrook to negotiate the purchase of Thornton's holdings. It was a complex process, but with Green Future's backing and the united front presented by the town, they were able to secure favorable terms. As news spread of Thornton's downfall and Millbrook's triumph, the town became something of a national sensation. Journalists descended on the small community, eager to tell the story of how a group of determined farmers had stood up to corporate greed and won. The day the deal was finalized, the town threw a celebration unlike anything Millbrook had seen in generations. Main Street was closed off for a massive block party, with food, music, and laughter filling the air. John stood on the steps of the town hall, Emily by his side, marveling at the joy on every face. Mayor Thompson approached them, beaming with pride. John, Emily, I don't know how we can ever thank you for what you've done for this town. John shook his head, feeling slightly overwhelmed. We didn't do it alone, Mayor. Every person in Millbrook played a part in this. That may be, the mayor replied, but it was your vision, your determination that sparked it all. Which is why. He paused for effect. The town council has voted unanimously to offer you both positions as co-chairs of Millbrook's new Agricultural Development Committee. What do you say? John and Emily exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Emily smiled and nodded, and John turned back to the mayor. We'd be honored, sir. As the mayor moved away to make the announcement to the crowd, John pulled Emily close. Can you believe it? He murmured. A year ago, I was on the verge of losing everything. And now. Emily leaned into him, her eyes shining with love and pride. And now you're the hero of Millbrook. I always knew you had it in you, John Hawkins. John shook his head, smiling. We're the heroes, Emily. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You brought hope back to this farm, to this town, to me. As cheers erupted from the crowd in response to the mayor's announcement, John cupped Emily's face in his hands. Emily Rodriguez, I love you. Will you marry me? Emily's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears of joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Their kiss was met with another round of cheers as the town celebrated not just their victory, but the love that had blossomed amidst the struggle. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Hawkins Rodriguez farm stood as a shining example of sustainable agriculture. The techniques pioneered there had spread throughout Millbrook and beyond, transforming the once struggling town into a thriving community known for its innovative farming practices. John and Emily, now happily married with twins on the way, continued to lead Millbrook's Agricultural Development Committee. Their partnership, both personal and professional, had become the stuff of local legend. Sarah Hawkins, now a doting grandmother-to-be, never tired of telling anyone who would listen about how her son and daughter-in-law had saved the farm and the town. And on a warm spring evening, as John and Emily sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset over their flourishing fields, John was reminded of something his father used to say. A Hawkins never quits. We bend, but we don't break. Looking at the life he and Emily had built together, at the thriving community around them, John smiled. They had done more than just not break, they had flourished, growing stronger with each challenge they faced. As Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand resting on her growing belly, John knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. For in Millbrook, on this land that had seen so much struggle and triumph, they had found not just success, but true happiness.